You don't need to listen closely or stay alert. Just get comfortable and let this slow journey through medieval Europe fade gently into the background. The history of the Middle Ages in Europe begins with a long and gradual transformation rather than a sudden break. The roots of this transformation lie in the final centuries of Roman rule in the western provinces. For generations, the Roman Empire had provided a shared political framework across much of Europe. Imperial administration connected distant regions through law, taxation, military organization, and infrastructure. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and cities shaped everyday movement and economic life. Written records supported governance, and Roman legal traditions defined social status and property. By the 3rd century, however, strains within the Roman system had become increasingly visible. The empire faced repeated military challenges along its frontiers, particularly along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Defending these borders required large standing armies, which placed heavy demands on state finances. Inflation weakened the value of currency. Tax burdens increased, especially on rural populations. Imperial authority remained real, but it relied more heavily on coercion and local cooperation than in earlier centuries. Administrative reforms attempted to stabilize the situation. Emperors reorganized provinces, divided authority among officials, and strengthened military command structures. These measures prolonged imperial survival, but also altered how power functioned. Local elites gained greater responsibility for collecting taxes and maintaining order. In many regions, aristocratic landowners became intermediaries between imperial officials and rural communities. This shift increased the importance of landed wealth and personal influence. During late antiquity, cultural life also evolved. Christianity spread steadily after receiving imperial support in the 4th century. Churches were built in cities and rural areas alike. Bishops became prominent public figures, often drawn from educated urban families. Christian teachings influenced moral expectations, social charity, and burial practices. Pagan traditions did not disappear immediately, but they gradually lost public support. At the same time, population movements intensified along the empire's borders. Groups labeled by Roman writers as Goths, Franks, Alemanni, Vandals, and others had long interacted with the Roman world. They traded, served as mercenaries, and adopted aspects of Roman culture. Over time, pressures from climate shifts, internal conflicts, and movements further east encouraged larger migrations. These groups did not share a single identity or goal, and their interactions with Rome varied widely. Some groups entered imperial territory under formal agreements. They were settled on Roman land in exchange for military service. Others crossed borders during periods of instability, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully. Roman responses ranged from military campaigns to negotiated settlements. These encounters gradually reshaped frontier regions and blurred distinctions between Roman and non-Roman populations. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, the Western imperial government struggled to maintain consistent control. Emperors depended heavily on powerful generals, many of whom commanded troops drawn from diverse backgrounds. Political instability increased as emperors were proclaimed and deposed in rapid succession. Central authority weakened, especially in provinces distant from Italy. The symbolic sack of Rome in 410 marked a psychological turning point. Although the city was no longer the capital, its capture by a Gothic force shocked contemporaries and later writers alike. Additional sacks occurred later in the century. These events reflected broader patterns of fragmentation rather than total collapse. Many Roman institutions continued to function at local levels, even as imperial leadership faltered. In 476, the formal deposition of the last Western emperor by a military leader marked the end of the Western Roman Empire as an institution. This moment later became a historical marker, though it did not represent a sudden change in daily life. Roman law remained in use. Land ownership continued under existing systems. Latin persisted as the language of administration, education, and worship. Across former imperial territories, new political arrangements emerged. These early medieval kingdoms developed slowly, often within existing Roman provincial boundaries. In Italy, rulers governed in cooperation with Roman senatorial families and church leaders. In Gaul, Frankish kings expanded their influence by combining military power with strategic alliances. In Spain, Visigothic rulers maintained Roman administrative practices while introducing their own legal traditions. These kingdoms were not uniform. Their authority depended on personal loyalty, military success, and control of land, rather than centralized bureaucracy. Kings traveled frequently, reinforcing their presence through assemblies and gift-giving. Written administration declined in some areas but survived in others, particularly within church institutions. Coinage continued, though minting became more localized and less standardized. Economic life adapted to changing conditions. Long-distance trade networks that once connected Western Europe to the Mediterranean world contracted. Imported luxury goods became rarer. Local production gained importance. Large rural estates became centers of economic activity, producing food, textiles, and tools. Peasant communities worked the land under varying arrangements, including tenancy and service obligations. Urban life persisted but changed in character. Many Roman cities shrank in population and physical size. Public buildings fell into disuse or were repurposed. Defensive walls were repaired or constructed. Markets continued to function, though on a smaller scale. Cities remained important as religious centers, particularly where bishops exercised authority. Social identities evolved during this period. Roman citizenship, once a unifying legal status, lost relevance without imperial institutions to enforce it. Identity became more localized and tied to family, region, and allegiance to particular leaders. Distinctions between Roman and non-Roman populations remained in law for generations, but gradually softened through intermarriage and shared economic life. Religion provided continuity amid change. Christian institutions maintained networks of communication across regions. Monasteries emerged as stable centers of prayer, learning, and land management. Monastic communities preserved manuscripts, trained clergy, and offered spiritual guidance. Over time, monasteries also became economic hubs within rural landscapes. Violence and insecurity were present but unevenly distributed. Some regions experienced frequent conflict, while others enjoyed long periods of stability. Warfare tended to involve small forces and limited objectives. Archaeological evidence shows continuity in farming, craftsmanship, and settlement patterns in many areas, suggesting adaptation rather than collapse. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire remained strong and influential. Its survival preserved Roman legal traditions and imperial ideals. Western rulers often sought legitimacy through association with Eastern emperors, even when political realities differed. Diplomatic contacts, religious debates, and occasional military campaigns linked the two halves of the former empire. By the 7th century, the transformation from Roman to medieval Europe was well advanced. Imperial authority in the West had faded, but Roman cultural foundations endured. New kingdoms governed diverse populations. Christianity shaped social norms and education. Economic life was rooted in land and local production. Political power rested on personal relationships rather than centralized administration. This long transition formed the opening chapter of the Middle Ages. It unfolded gradually across generations, shaped by adaptation, continuity, and change. From these foundations, medieval European society would continue to develop in complex and varied ways, carrying forward both Roman legacies and new traditions. After the end of centralized Roman rule in the West, political life in Europe continued through a long period of adjustment and experimentation. Authority did not vanish, but it was reorganized around new centers of power. Across former Roman provinces, a series of early medieval kingdoms emerged. These kingdoms were shaped by local conditions, inherited Roman practices, and the leadership styles of new ruling elites. Their development unfolded gradually over several centuries, forming the political framework of early medieval Europe. In Gaul, the most enduring of these kingdoms was established by the Franks. Frankish groups had lived along the Rhine frontier for generations, interacting closely with Roman military and administrative systems. Over time, their leaders expanded control into Roman territory. The consolidation of Frankish power occurred through a combination of warfare, alliance building, and absorption of existing Roman elites. Frankish kings ruled over mixed populations that included people who identified as Roman and others whose ancestry lay outside the former empire. Frankish kingship relied on personal authority rather than fixed institutions. Kings were expected to lead in war, distribute land and wealth, and uphold justice. Loyalty was reinforced through gift-giving and protection. Written law codes were produced, often recording customary practices alongside Roman legal concepts. These texts helped regulate disputes and clarify social obligations, even though enforcement depended largely on local authority. In Italy, political authority followed a different path. After the end of imperial rule, the region experienced a series of competing powers. Some rulers governed in the name of Roman tradition, maintaining cooperation with the Roman Senate and church officials. Later, new groups established control over parts of the peninsula, ruling alongside Roman populations. Italian political life remained closely tied to urban centers and ecclesiastical leadership, especially in cities that retained administrative importance. In the Iberian Peninsula, Visigothic rulers created a kingdom that encompassed much of modern Spain and Portugal. Visigothic kings adopted Roman administrative practices and legal traditions to govern their territories. Over time, they produced comprehensive law codes that applied to both Roman and Gothic populations, reducing legal distinctions between groups. This process reflected a broader trend toward integration within early medieval societies. In Britain, the withdrawal of Roman administration led to more fragmented political structures. Roman urban life declined more sharply than in many continental regions. New kingdoms emerged over time, often associated with groups later described as Anglo-Saxons. These kingdoms developed their own systems of kingship, law, and social hierarchy. Written records were limited in early periods, but archaeological evidence points to organized agricultural communities and evolving political authority. Across these regions, early medieval kingship shared common features. Kings ruled through personal relationships rather than centralized bureaucracies. Authority was mobile and depended on presence. Assemblies of nobles and warriors played important roles in decision-making. Law was often proclaimed orally and reinforced through customary practice. Written documents existed, but were less widespread than in Roman times. Land ownership became central to political power. Control of land allowed rulers to reward followers and support military forces. Large estates formed the economic backbone of early medieval kingdoms. These estates were worked by dependent populations who owed labor, rent, or service. While conditions varied widely, social hierarchy became more pronounced, with clear distinctions between elites and rural laborers. The decline of imperial taxation systems further reinforced this shift. Without centralized tax collection, rulers relied on land-based wealth and direct control of resources. This encouraged localized governance and strengthened regional identities. Political boundaries were often fluid, changing with the fortunes of individual rulers and dynasties. Religion played a stabilizing role in these emerging kingdoms. Christian institutions provided continuity with the Roman past and offered legitimacy to new rulers. Many kings converted to Christianity or supported the church to strengthen their authority. Bishops often served as advisors and administrators. Church councils helped standardize religious practices and resolve disputes, contributing to a shared cultural framework across regions. Monastic communities expanded during this period. Monasteries offered structured religious life and became centers of learning, agriculture, and manuscript production. They preserved religious texts and elements of classical knowledge. Monasteries also held land and interacted closely with local elites, embedding them deeply within early medieval society. Cultural life during this era reflected both continuity and change. Latin remained the language of worship and administration, though spoken forms evolved into regional dialects. Artistic styles blended Roman techniques with new influences visible in metalwork, manuscripts, and architecture. Education was largely confined to ecclesiastical settings, but literacy persisted among clergy and some elites. Warfare remained a feature of political life, though its scale and nature differed from Roman campaigns. Armies were smaller and often assembled for specific purposes. Conflict focused on territorial control, tribute, and personal rivalry rather than ideological goals. Despite frequent warfare, long periods of stability existed within many kingdoms. By the 8th century, early medieval kingdoms had become established features of the European landscape. Their structures were diverse but shared common foundations rooted in land, personal authority, and Christian institutions. These kingdoms laid the groundwork for later medieval political developments. Their gradual formation marked a crucial stage in the shaping of medieval Europe, bridging the world inherited from Rome and the societies that would follow. As early medieval kingdoms took shape across Europe, one institution extended steadily across political boundaries and provided a shared framework of belief, practice, and organization. This institution was the Christian Church. Its influence grew gradually from the foundations laid during the later Roman Empire, and it became one of the most enduring structures of medieval European life. During the early Middle Ages, the Church did not operate as a single unified body in the modern sense, but as a network of local communities connected by doctrine, ritual, and communication. Christianity had already been well established in Roman cities before the end of imperial rule in the West. Bishops led urban congregations and managed church property. Councils met to resolve doctrinal questions and administrative disputes. When imperial authority weakened, these ecclesiastical structures remained in place. In many regions, bishops became among the most stable and recognizable leaders in society, maintaining continuity as secular governance shifted. The role of bishops expanded during this period. In cities where Roman officials were no longer present or had limited power, bishops took on practical responsibilities. They oversaw charitable distribution of food and aid. They represented local communities in negotiations with military leaders. They helped maintain order during times of instability. Their authority rested not only on religious leadership but also on their education, literacy, and connections to broader networks. Church organization followed inherited Roman patterns. Dioceses often matched former Roman administrative districts. This continuity allowed ecclesiastical authority to map onto familiar territorial boundaries. Communication between bishops, though slower than in Roman times, continued through letters and occasional councils. These exchanges helped maintain shared beliefs and practices across regions. The spread of Christianity into rural areas advanced more slowly than in cities. While urban centers often had established congregations by late Roman times, many rural communities retained pre-Christian traditions well into the early Middle Ages. Clergy gradually extended pastoral care into the countryside. Small churches were built near villages and estates. Over generations, Christian rituals became embedded in agricultural life, marking seasons, births, marriages, and deaths. Monasticism became a defining feature of early medieval Christianity. Inspired by earlier ascetic traditions from the Eastern Mediterranean, Monastic life emphasized withdrawal from worldly concerns in favor of prayer, discipline, and communal living. Monasteries varied widely in size and organization. Some housed only a few individuals, while others developed into large communities with extensive lands. Monastic rules provided structure for daily life. These rules set schedules for prayer, work, and study. Agricultural labor supported monastic communities and connected them to surrounding populations. Monasteries cleared land, improved farming practices, and managed estates. Through these activities, they became important economic as well as spiritual centers. Literacy survived and was largely concentrated within the church. Clergy and monks learned to read and write Latin in order to study scripture and conduct worship. Manuscripts were copied by hand in monastic settings. Religious texts were prioritized, but works of Roman law, history, and philosophy were also preserved. This process was gradual and selective, shaped by local resources and interests. Education during this period was limited but continuous. Cathedral schools and monastic schools trained clergy. Instruction focused on reading, basic grammar, and religious knowledge. Advanced learning was rare, but intellectual traditions were not lost. The transmission of knowledge occurred slowly, sustained by generations of clerics committed to study. The church also played a central role in shaping moral expectations. Christian teachings influenced attitudes toward charity, marriage, and social responsibility. Care for the poor and sick became a religious obligation. Hospitals and hostels, often connected to churches or monasteries, provided shelter and aid. These institutions varied widely in scale and effectiveness, but they reflected a growing emphasis on organized charity. Relations between church leaders and secular rulers were complex and evolving. Kings often sought the support of bishops and abbots to legitimize their authority. In return, rulers granted land, privileges, and protection to church institutions. These exchanges strengthened both sides but also created tensions. Questions about the limits of royal influence over ecclesiastical appointments emerged gradually. Conversion of rulers played an important role in the spread of Christianity. When kings adopted the faith, they often encouraged or required their followers to do the same. This process was uneven and sometimes resisted. Conversion did not always lead to immediate changes in belief or practice, but it established Christianity as a framework for political and social life. Missionary activity extended Christian influence beyond former Roman territories. Clerics traveled to regions where Christianity was less established, often supported by kings or monastic networks. These missions proceeded slowly and adapted to local conditions. Christian practices blended with existing customs, creating regional variations in worship and belief. The church also contributed to legal and administrative life. Ecclesiastical courts handled certain disputes, particularly those involving clergy or marriage. Church councils issued regulations that influenced social behavior. Written records produced by the church helped preserve legal memory and administrative continuity in an era with limited documentation. By the 8th century, the Christian church had become deeply embedded in early medieval society. It provided continuity across political boundaries and connected local communities to a broader cultural world. Its institutions shaped education, charity, law, and daily rhythms of life. While practices varied widely across regions, the church offered a shared framework that endured through centuries of change. This growing ecclesiastical presence did not replace secular authority but interacted with it constantly. Together, church and kingdom formed the foundations of medieval European society. From these foundations, further political, cultural, and intellectual developments would emerge in the centuries that followed. The political reorganization of Western Europe, associated with the Carolingian period, unfolded gradually over the course of the 8th and 9th centuries. It emerged from earlier Frankish traditions but developed new forms of authority that would shape medieval governance for generations. This era was not defined by sudden innovation, but by deliberate attempts to stabilize rule, extend control over diverse regions, and give structure to a society that had inherited the remains of Roman administration alongside newer customs. Before the rise of the Carolingians, the Frankish kingdoms were formally ruled by the Merovingian dynasty. These kings traced their legitimacy to long-standing traditions and ancestry, but over time their practical authority diminished. Day-to-day governance increasingly fell to royal officials known as mayors of the palace. Originally responsible for managing the royal household, these officials expanded their influence into military leadership and political coordination. By the early 8th century, the mayor of the palace often commanded armies, negotiated alliances, and directed administration, while the king's role became largely symbolic. This shift did not occur in isolation. Frankish society placed great value on effective leadership, military success, and the ability to protect land and people. As Merovingian kings became less active in these roles, powerful noble families filled the gap. Among them, one lineage steadily accumulated influence through careful consolidation of land, military resources, and political alliances. Their authority was reinforced by cooperation with church leaders who valued stability and protection for ecclesiastical property. In the mid-8th century, this arrangement was formalized when the Carolingian family assumed the royal title. With the support of leading clergy, the reigning Merovingian king was removed, and a new ruler was crowned. This act reflected changing ideas about legitimacy. Kingship was increasingly understood as a responsibility tied to governance and moral order rather than a purely hereditary status. The church's involvement gave religious sanction to political change, reinforcing the close relationship between sacred authority and secular power. Once established as kings, the Carolingians pursued territorial expansion and internal consolidation. Military campaigns were undertaken against neighboring regions, not as isolated raids, but as sustained efforts to extend control. Conquered territories were integrated into existing structures through the appointment of loyal officials and the establishment of church institutions. These measures aimed to create a stable framework rather than temporary domination. The reign of Charlemagne marked the most extensive realization of Carolingian ambitions. Over several decades, his authority extended across a large portion of Western and Central Europe. This realm is often described as the Carolingian Empire, though its organization differed significantly from that of the ancient Roman Empire. It lacked a permanent capital and a centralized bureaucracy, relying instead on personal leadership and regional administration. Charlemagne's governance was characterized by constant movement. He traveled throughout his territories, holding assemblies and overseeing local affairs. These gatherings brought together nobles, bishops, and other officials to address military obligations, legal disputes, and administrative reforms. Decisions made at these assemblies were recorded in written instructions, which outlined expectations for behavior, justice, and governance. These documents reflected an effort to standardize practices across diverse regions, while allowing for local variation. Administration under the Carolingians relied heavily on appointed officials. Counts governed local districts, where they were responsible for maintaining order, administering justice, and raising troops. Their authority was significant, but not absolute. To oversee them, royal envoys were dispatched periodically to inspect local administration, hear complaints, and ensure that royal directives were being followed. This system aimed to balance local autonomy with overarching royal authority. Law during this period remained pluralistic. Different populations continued to live under their own customary laws, which were often written down and preserved. Carolingian rulers did not attempt to impose a single legal code across the entire realm. Instead, royal decrees addressed issues that affected the kingdom as a whole, such as military service, protection of church property, and standards of justice. This approach reflected both practicality and respect for established traditions. The relationship between the Carolingian rulers and the church was central to their vision of order. Kings supported the expansion of bishoprics and monasteries, granting land and privileges. In return, church leaders provided administrative expertise, literacy, and moral guidance. Bishops and abbots often served as advisors and officials, contributing to governance while reinforcing Christian norms throughout society. Educational reform formed an important part of this cooperation. Charlemagne and his advisors encouraged the improvement of clerical education to ensure accurate teaching and administration. Schools were established at royal courts, monasteries, and cathedrals. Instruction focused on Latin literacy, scripture, and basic learning. While these reforms reached only a small segment of the population, they helped preserve written culture and improve communication across the realm. Economic life during the Carolingian period remained grounded in agriculture. Royal authority depended on control of land rather than monetary taxation. Estates supported royal households, military retinues, and religious institutions. Agricultural management became more systematic in some areas, guided by written estate records. Trade existed, particularly in regional markets, but long-distance commerce remained limited. Despite its size, the Carolingian political system depended on personal relationships. Loyalty was reinforced through oaths, land grants, and shared participation in campaigns. This network functioned effectively under strong leadership but required constant attention. Communication across long distances was slow, and enforcement of decisions depended heavily on local cooperation. The imperial title assumed by Charlemagne carried symbolic weight. It reflected an effort to revive the idea of universal Christian rulership in the West, drawing on Roman traditions and religious authority. While this title did not recreate Roman administrative structures, it influenced how authority was understood and justified. It reinforced the idea that political unity and Christian order were interconnected. After Charlemagne's death, maintaining this unity proved challenging. The empire was divided among heirs according to established customs. These divisions reflected both family arrangements and the realities of governing vast territories. Over time, central authority weakened and regional leaders gained greater independence. This fragmentation did not erase Carolingian influence but transformed it. The Carolingian period left lasting foundations for medieval Europe. It shaped ideas of kingship, administration, and the relationship between secular and religious authority. It demonstrated both the potential and the limits of large-scale political organization in a post-Roman world. As Carolingian structures loosened, new forms of local power and social organization emerged, leading into the next phase of medieval history. The period that followed the fragmentation of Carolingian authority was marked by profound changes in how power, land, and social relationships were organized across medieval Europe. This phase, often described as the Central Middle Ages, did not begin at a single moment, nor did it unfold uniformly across all regions. Instead, it developed gradually from the late 9th century onward as political unity weakened and local forms of authority became increasingly important. The structures that emerged during this time shaped everyday life for centuries and formed the underlying framework of medieval society. After the division of Carolingian territories among heirs, royal power became more localized and less consistent. Kings continued to exist, but their ability to enforce authority over wide regions diminished. Communication was slow, resources were limited, and loyalty was increasingly tied to immediate personal relationships rather than distant rulers. In this environment, local leaders gained prominence. These figures controlled land, commanded armed followers, and provided protection to surrounding communities. Land became the central source of wealth and power. Unlike the Roman system, which had relied heavily on taxation and centralized administration, medieval rulers depended on control of estates and agricultural production. Those who held land could support themselves, equip warriors, and maintain authority. As a result, landholding elites became the dominant political actors in much of Europe. The social relationships that developed around landholding formed the basis of what is often described as feudal organization. This was not a single unified system imposed across Europe, but a collection of practices that varied by region and evolved over time. At its core was the idea that land could be granted in exchange for service, especially military service. These grants created bonds between lords and their followers, shaping political and social hierarchies. A lord was typically a landholding noble who exercised authority over an estate or territory. In return for loyalty and service, a lord might grant land to a follower, often called a vassal. This land was usually held with specific obligations attached. The vassal was expected to provide military support, attend the lord's court, and offer counsel when required. These obligations were personal and reciprocal, reinforced through ceremonies and oaths. Such relationships were layered rather than strictly hierarchical. A single individual could be both a lord to some and a vassal to another. This created complex networks of allegiance that connected local communities to broader political structures. These networks provided stability in a world where centralized authority was weak. But they also contributed to fragmentation as loyalties were divided and authority was dispersed. Military service was a central element of these arrangements. Warfare during this period was typically small-scale and localized. Armies consisted of relatively small groups of mounted warriors supported by infantry drawn from local populations. Fortified structures, such as castles, became increasingly common. These served both as defensive positions and as symbols of lordly authority. Castles were often constructed of earth and timber at first, later replaced by stone in wealthier regions. The presence of castles reshaped landscapes and social relations. They offered protection in times of conflict, but also reinforced the power of those who controlled them. Surrounding communities depended on local lords for defense, while lords relied on the labor and support of these communities to maintain their position. This mutual dependence was a defining feature of medieval society. Below the level of the nobility, the majority of the population lived in rural communities and worked the land. Peasant life was structured around agriculture, seasonal rhythms, and obligations to landholders. Peasants were not a uniform group. Some were free farmers who owned or rented land under relatively flexible terms. Others were bound by various forms of dependence that limited their mobility and legal rights. These dependent peasants, often described as serfs in later terminology, were tied to specific estates. They owed labor, produce, or payments to their lords in exchange for access to land and protection. Their obligations were customary rather than contractual, shaped by local tradition. While their lives were constrained, they were not enslaved. They had families, maintained homes, and participated in village communities. Village life revolved around collective agricultural practices. Fields were often divided into strips cultivated by individual households, while pastures and woodlands were shared. Cooperation was necessary for tasks such as plowing, harvesting, and maintaining infrastructure. Local customs regulated these activities, providing stability and predictability across generations. The manorial system developed as a way of organizing rural life and production. A manor typically included the lord's residence, lands reserved for his use, and plots worked by peasants. Manorial courts handled local disputes and enforced obligations. These courts were important centers of authority, blending economic, legal, and social functions. Religion remained deeply integrated into daily life during this period. The local church or chapel served as both a spiritual and social center. Clergy performed religious rites, marked the calendar with festivals, and reinforced moral expectations. The church also benefited from land grants and labor obligations, becoming a significant landholder in its own right. Monasteries continued to play a vital role, They managed large estates, experimented with agricultural techniques, and provided education and charity. Monastic lands were often well organized, serving as models of estate management. Monks and nuns lived under structured rules that emphasized discipline and stability, contributing to the preservation of literacy and administrative practices. Political authority during this phase was often exercised through courts and assemblies. Lords held courts to resolve disputes, administer justice, and reinforce their status. These gatherings brought together free men, vassals, and officials. Law was largely customary, based on precedent and local tradition rather than written codes. Nevertheless, written records gradually increased, especially in connection with land transactions and ecclesiastical administration. Violence was a persistent feature of this era, but it was generally limited in scale. Conflicts arose over land, inheritance, and honor. Raids and feuds were common, but prolonged warfare was less frequent than in later centuries. Efforts were made by church authorities to limit violence through religious sanctions and negotiated truces, reflecting a concern for social order. Trade and towns did not disappear during this period, though they played a secondary role compared to agriculture. Some towns survived from Roman times, while others developed around castles, monasteries, or river crossings. Markets facilitated local exchange of goods such as grain, livestock, and crafts. Long-distance trade was limited, but persisted in certain regions, particularly along rivers and coastal areas. Craft production took place largely within rural households or small workshops. Blacksmiths, carpenters, potters, and other artisans provided essential goods. Their work was closely tied to agricultural needs. Over time, some artisans began to cluster in settlements that would later develop into towns. Family and kinship were central to social organization. Marriage was an important means of forming alliances and securing property. Inheritance customs varied widely, influencing how land was divided or preserved within families. These practices shaped the distribution of power and wealth over generations. Women's roles during this period were shaped by social status and local custom. Noble women managed estates, arranged marriages, and exercised influence within households. Peasant women worked alongside men in agricultural tasks and household production. Religious life offered alternative paths through monastic communities where women could gain education and authority within certain limits. Cultural life during this phase was largely oral. Stories, songs, and traditions were passed down through performance rather than writing. Literacy remained concentrated among clergy and some nobles. Latin continued to be used for religious and administrative purposes, while spoken languages evolved into distinct regional forms. Over time, these structures produced a relatively stable social order, though it was always subject to change. Authority was decentralized, rooted in land and personal relationships. This arrangement allowed medieval society to function in the absence of strong centralized states. But it also limited broader coordination and political unity. As the centuries progressed, pressures began to build within this system. Population growth, agricultural expansion, and increased trade gradually transformed economic and social conditions. These developments would lead to new forms of organization and authority, setting the stage for the next phase of medieval history. The phase that followed the stabilization of local lordship and rural social structures was marked by slow but far-reaching economic and demographic change. From roughly the 10th century onward, many regions of Europe experienced sustained agricultural growth, rising population levels, and the gradual revival of towns and long-distance trade. These developments unfolded unevenly and over long periods, but together they reshaped medieval society in ways that would become increasingly visible over the following centuries. Agriculture remained the foundation of life for the vast majority of people, and changes in farming practices were central to broader transformation. In earlier centuries, much land had been underused or abandoned due to population decline and insecurity. As conditions stabilized, communities expanded cultivation into new areas. Forests were cleared, wetlands were drained, and marginal lands were brought into production. This process was gradual and labor-intensive, often carried out over generations by peasant families working within established village systems. Improvements in agricultural techniques supported this expansion. Heavier plows adapted to dense northern soils allowed deeper and more effective cultivation. The use of animal power increased, particularly with the wider adoption of horse harnesses that distributed weight more efficiently. Crop rotation practices developed in many regions, allowing fields to be used more intensively while maintaining soil fertility. These changes did not occur everywhere at once, but where they did take hold, they increased yields and reduced the risk of famine. As food production became more reliable, population levels began to rise. This growth was slow by modern standards but significant in medieval terms. Higher birth rates and improved survival led to denser settlement patterns. Villages expanded and new ones were founded. In some regions, lords actively encouraged settlement by offering favorable terms to those willing to cultivate unused land. These arrangements reflected both economic opportunity and the continuing importance of land as the basis of wealth. Population growth placed new pressures on existing social structures. Land that had once been plentiful became more closely managed. Inheritance practices adapted to ensure continuity of holdings, sometimes favoring single heirs or encouraging younger family members to seek opportunities elsewhere. These pressures contributed to migration within regions and toward emerging towns. Alongside agricultural expansion, trade networks began to revive and extend. Local markets had always existed, but increased production created surplus goods that could be exchanged beyond immediate communities. Grain, wine, wool, salt, and timber moved along rivers and roads connecting regions. Trade remained limited by transport costs and risks, but steady improvement in security and infrastructure supported gradual expansion. Towns played a key role in this process. Some towns had survived from Roman times, though often in reduced form. Others developed anew at strategic locations such as river crossings, coastal harbors, crossroads, or near castles and monasteries. These settlements attracted artisans, merchants, and laborers who were not directly engaged in agriculture. Over time, towns became centers of exchange, craft production, and administration. Urban growth altered social dynamics. Town residents often lived under different legal arrangements than rural populations. In many places, townspeople gained privileges such as collective self-government, exemption from certain obligations, or the right to hold markets. These privileges were typically granted by kings or lords in exchange for taxes or political support. Town charters formalized rights and responsibilities, creating distinct urban communities. Craft specialization increased within towns. Artisans organized their work around specific trades, producing textiles, metal goods, pottery, and other items. Production was generally small-scale and based on household workshops. Skills were transmitted through apprenticeships, ensuring continuity and quality. Over time, craft communities developed shared standards and collective identities. Long-distance trade expanded gradually, linking distant regions of Europe. Merchants traveled along established routes, often following rivers such as the Rhine, Rhone, and Danube. Coastal trade connected northern and southern Europe through maritime routes. Goods moved slowly and in limited quantities, but the regularity of exchange increased. Certain regions became known for specific products, integrating local economies into wider networks. Merchant activity required cooperation and trust. Traders formed partnerships, shared risks, and relied on customary practices to resolve disputes. Over time, merchant communities developed shared norms that facilitated exchange across political boundaries. In Northern Europe, networks of trading towns cooperated to protect commercial interests and secure favorable conditions for trade. One such network later became known as the Hanseatic League, reflecting the growing importance of organized commerce. Money played an increasing role in economic life. Coinage had never disappeared entirely, but its use expanded as trade grew. Monetary transactions allowed rents, taxes, and wages to be paid in coin rather than in kind. This shift did not replace traditional obligations immediately, but it added flexibility and encouraged market exchange. Lords and rulers benefited from monetary income, which could be used to hire labor or fund construction. The revival of towns also had cultural and administrative consequences. Literacy became more useful in commercial contexts, leading to increased use of written records such as contracts, account books, and correspondence. While Latin remained the primary written language, local languages began to appear in practical documents. This development reflected changing needs rather than formal education. Religious institutions remained closely involved in these changes. Churches and monasteries owned land, collected rents, and participated in markets. Pilgrimage routes stimulated travel and exchange, supporting inns, markets, and transport services. Religious festivals attracted visitors and merchants, reinforcing the connection between spiritual and economic life. Urban religious institutions adapted to new conditions. Parish churches served growing populations, while mendicant religious movements later emerged to address the spiritual needs of townspeople. These developments reflected the diversification of medieval society and the changing relationship between community, economy, and belief. Political authority adjusted in response to economic growth. Kings and lords recognized the value of prosperous towns and sought to regulate trade, coinage, and market activity. Toll stations, customs duties, and market rights became important sources of revenue. At the same time, rulers had to negotiate with urban communities that demanded recognition of their privileges. Social stratification within towns became more pronounced over time. Wealthy merchants and successful artisans gained influence, often forming urban elites. Poorer laborers and newcomers occupied more precarious positions. Despite these differences, towns offered opportunities for mobility that were less available in rural settings. Rural life was also affected by broader economic change. Increased demand for agricultural products encouraged specialization in some regions. Vineyards, sheep pastures, and grain fields expanded according to market conditions. Peasants engaged more frequently with markets, selling surplus and purchasing goods they could not produce themselves. These developments did not eliminate hardship or inequality. Crop failures, disease, and local conflict continued to threaten stability. Growth was uneven, and some regions lagged behind others. Nevertheless, the overall trend was toward greater connectivity, increased production, and more complex social organization. By the early 13th century, much of Europe had been transformed by these gradual processes. Population levels were higher than they had been for centuries. Towns were established features of the landscape. Trade networks linked distant regions. Economic life had become more varied and interconnected, though still rooted in land and agriculture. These changes set the conditions for further developments in political authority, social structure, and cultural life. As medieval society grew more complex, new challenges and opportunities emerged. The next phase would see efforts to consolidate power, regulate expanding economies, and define social order more clearly within an increasingly interconnected European world. The period, often described as the High Middle Ages, was characterized by increasing consolidation across many areas of medieval European life. From roughly the 11th through the early 13th centuries, political authority, social organization, and institutional structures became more clearly defined and more stable in many regions. This was not a uniform or uninterrupted process, but a gradual tightening of systems that had developed earlier. The foundations laid during previous centuries now supported more complex forms of governance and social order. Political authority during this phase became more visibly structured. Kingship in many regions gained greater coherence as rulers developed clearer claims to authority over defined territories. Royal power remained dependent on land and personal relationships, but rulers increasingly sought to regularize their control. Courts became more permanent institutions rather than occasional gatherings. Officials were appointed with more specific duties, and written records were used more frequently to document decisions, rights, and obligations. In several regions, monarchies strengthened their position relative to local nobles. Kings asserted rights to justice, taxation, and military service that extended beyond their personal estates. These claims were often contested and required negotiation, but over time they contributed to more centralized forms of rule. Royal authority was reinforced through symbols, rituals, and legal traditions that emphasized continuity and legitimacy. Noble power did not disappear during this process, but it became more clearly integrated into broader political frameworks. Nobles continued to control land and exercise local authority, but their relationships with rulers were increasingly defined by formal obligations. Feudal bonds were articulated more explicitly, with expectations regarding service, counsel, and loyalty. Written agreements and charters clarified these relationships, reducing ambiguity while also creating new points of tension. Law and justice became more systematized during this period. While customary law remained important, rulers and local authorities increasingly sought to record legal principles and procedures. Courts operated at multiple levels, from village and manorial courts to royal and ecclesiastical courts. Appeals and overlapping jurisdictions reflected the complexity of medieval legal life rather than a single unified system. The growth of legal culture was supported by rising literacy among clerics and officials. Written documentation became more common in matters of landholding, inheritance, and governance. Charters recorded grants and privileges, court proceedings were noted in registers. This expansion of record-keeping did not replace oral tradition, but complemented it, adding stability and continuity to legal practice. Military organization also evolved during the High Middle Ages. Castles became more numerous and more permanent, increasingly constructed of stone. These fortifications served defensive purposes but also symbolized authority and control over surrounding territory. Warfare remained limited in scale but was more structured, with clearer obligations for service and more formalized command. Knighthood emerged as a distinct social and military identity during this period. Mounted warriors who served lords and kings developed shared codes of conduct, training practices, and social expectations. While ideals associated with knighthood were articulated in literature and ritual, everyday military life remained practical and focused on service, landholding, and obligation. Economic growth continued to influence political consolidation. Rulers benefited from expanding trade and monetization, which provided new sources of revenue. Taxes, tolls, and fees supplemented income from land. This additional revenue allowed rulers to support administrative staff, maintain fortifications, and conduct diplomacy more effectively. Towns played an increasingly important role in political life. Urban communities negotiated privileges and charters that defined their relationship with rulers. In return for financial contributions and loyalty, towns gained degrees of self-government. Urban elites participated in regional politics, sometimes supporting royal authority against local nobles, sometimes defending their own autonomy. The church remained a central institution during the High Middle Ages, but its organization also became more structured. Ecclesiastical hierarchy was clarified, and administrative procedures were refined. Church courts expanded their jurisdiction, particularly in matters related to marriage, inheritance, and moral conduct. This expansion sometimes brought church authorities into conflict with secular rulers, leading to negotiations and disputes over authority. Monastic life diversified during this period. Established monasteries continued to manage land and preserve learning, while new religious movements emphasized different forms of discipline and community life. These developments reflected broader social changes, including urban growth and increased concern for pastoral care. Intellectual life expanded gradually. Schools associated with cathedrals and religious institutions attracted students from wider regions. Study of law, theology, and philosophy developed more systematic methods. Latin remained the primary language of learning, but vernacular languages gained importance in administration and literature. Social hierarchy during the High Middle Ages became more clearly articulated. Distinctions between nobles, clergy, townspeople, and peasants were reinforced through law, custom, and economic roles. These divisions were not absolute, and mobility remained possible, but social order was increasingly conceptualized as a structured whole. Family and inheritance practices adapted to changing conditions. Noble families emphasized lineage and continuity, often consolidating landholdings through strategic marriages. Peasant families adjusted inheritance to balance continuity with the needs of growing populations. These practices shaped long-term patterns of land distribution and social stability. Despite increasing order, conflict remained a feature of medieval life. Disputes over land, rights, and authority persisted at all levels of society. However, mechanisms for resolving conflict became more developed. Negotiation, arbitration, and legal proceedings complemented military force, reflecting a growing preference for stability and predictability. By the early 13th century, much of Europe displayed a more consolidated medieval order. Political authority was more clearly defined, social roles were more structured, and institutions operated with greater regularity. This did not mean uniformity or peace, but it marked a period in which medieval society reached a level of organization that would shape subsequent centuries. These developments created both resilience and rigidity. The systems that brought stability also limited flexibility, setting the conditions for future tensions. As medieval society continued to evolve, pressures would emerge that tested these consolidated structures and led to further transformation. During the later part of the medieval period, religious authority, intellectual life, and cultural expression became more deeply structured and more widely visible across Europe. These developments did not replace earlier forms of belief or learning, but they expanded, formalized, and interconnected them. From roughly the 12th century onward, religious institutions refined their organization, intellectual activity became more systematic, and cultural production diversified. Together, these processes shaped how medieval people understood the world, their place within it, and the order of society. Religious authority in medieval Europe rested on long-established foundations, but during this period it became more clearly articulated and more consistently exercised. The Christian Church had already been central to medieval life for centuries, yet its internal organization and external influence continued to evolve. Ecclesiastical hierarchy became more defined, with clearer distinctions between different levels of authority. Bishops, archbishops, and other senior clergy exercised jurisdiction over defined territories, while parish priests provided pastoral care at the local level. Church administration relied increasingly on written records. Registers were kept of appointments, decisions, and disputes. Canon law, the body of church law governing religious practice and clerical conduct, expanded and was organized into collections that could be studied and applied more systematically. This development reflected a broader trend toward formalization and consistency within medieval institutions. The relationship between religious and secular authority remained complex. Kings and nobles continued to influence church appointments and benefices, while church leaders asserted spiritual independence and moral authority. Disputes over jurisdiction and rights were common, particularly regarding the appointment of bishops and control of church lands. These conflicts were usually resolved through negotiation, councils, or legal argument rather than prolonged violence, demonstrating the growing importance of institutional mechanisms. The church's influence extended deeply into everyday life. Religious rituals marked time and structured the calendar. Feast days, fasts, and festivals regulated work and rest. Life events such as birth, marriage, and death were accompanied by religious ceremonies that reinforced communal bonds and shared beliefs. Participation in religious life was expected, though individual levels of understanding and devotion varied widely. Monasticism continued to be a vital component of religious culture. Older monastic communities persisted, managing estates and maintaining traditions of prayer and study. Alongside them, new forms of religious life emerged that emphasized mobility, preaching, and engagement with urban populations. These movements reflected changing social conditions, particularly the growth of towns and the increasing diversity of medieval society. Intellectual life during this period expanded significantly in scope and organization. Learning had always been preserved within ecclesiastical settings, but from the 12th century onward it became more systematic and more widely shared among educated elites. Schools attached to cathedrals and monasteries attracted students from across regions. These schools developed structured curricula that emphasized grammar, logic, rhetoric, and theology. Over time, centers of advanced study emerged that later came to be known as universities. These institutions were not created by a single authority, but developed organically from existing schools and scholarly communities. They were characterized by formal organization, recognized teaching authority, and a shared commitment to study. Scholars traveled between centers of learning, contributing to the exchange of ideas and methods. Latin remained the primary language of instruction and scholarship. Its continued use allowed intellectual exchange across linguistic boundaries. At the same time, spoken languages evolved and were increasingly used in practical writing and literary expression. This coexistence of Latin and vernacular languages reflected the layered nature of medieval culture. The study of theology occupied a central place in medieval intellectual life. Scholars sought to understand religious doctrine through careful reading of scripture and earlier authorities. They developed methods of argument and analysis that emphasized clarity, consistency, and logical reasoning. This approach did not challenge religious belief, but aimed to deepen understanding within an accepted framework. Law also became an important field of study. Both canon law and secular law were examined and taught systematically. Legal education supported the administration of church and state, providing trained individuals capable of managing disputes, drafting documents, and advising rulers. This contributed to the increasing sophistication of governance and institutional life. Philosophical inquiry expanded alongside theology and law. Medieval thinkers engaged with inherited texts from earlier periods, including works preserved from antiquity. These texts were studied, interpreted, and integrated into contemporary thought. Intellectual activity was cumulative, building upon established authorities while refining methods of analysis. Cultural expression during this period reflected religious and intellectual developments. Architecture became more ambitious and more symbolic. Churches and cathedrals were constructed on larger scales, incorporating complex designs and advanced building techniques. These structures served religious functions, but also expressed communal identity and institutional authority. Artistic production extended beyond architecture. Manuscript illumination, sculpture, metalwork, and textiles displayed increasing skill and stylistic variety. Much of this work was commissioned by religious institutions or elites, but it also reflected local traditions and materials. Artistic themes were often religious, though secular motifs appeared as well. Literary culture diversified. Alongside religious texts, histories, legal documents, and scholarly treatises, works of vernacular literature circulated more widely. These included narratives, poetry, and didactic texts that addressed moral, social, and practical concerns. Oral performance remained important, but written transmission increased. Music played a central role in religious life. Chant and liturgical music structured worship and reinforced shared practices. Musical notation developed gradually, allowing more precise transmission of melodies. This supported consistency across regions and contributed to the preservation of musical traditions. Education remained limited to a small portion of the population, but its influence extended beyond formal settings. Clergy trained in schools brought literacy and administrative skills to local communities. Written records affected landholding, legal disputes, and governance. Intellectual methods influenced how problems were approached and resolved. Religious authority also shaped moral expectations. Church teachings addressed issues such as marriage, family life, economic behavior, and social responsibility. Confession and pastoral care emphasized personal accountability. These practices reinforced norms while allowing for variation in local interpretation. Despite increased structure, medieval religious and intellectual life was not uniform. Regional differences persisted in practice, emphasis, and expression. Local traditions blended with broader institutional frameworks. Disagreements and debates occurred within accepted boundaries, contributing to ongoing development rather than rupture. Cultural life was deeply embedded in social structures. Patronage played a key role as elites supported religious institutions, artists, and scholars. In return, cultural production reinforced social order and authority. This reciprocal relationship shaped the form and content of medieval culture. By the late 13th century, religious authority, intellectual activity, and cultural expression had become more interconnected and more visible across Europe. Institutions operated with greater consistency. Learning was more organized. Cultural forms were more elaborate. These developments did not represent an end point, but a phase of maturation within medieval society. The structures that supported religious and intellectual life also created expectations and constraints. As conditions changed, these structures would face new pressures. The balance between tradition and adaptation would continue to shape medieval experience, leading into a period of challenge and transformation that followed. The period, often described as the late Middle Ages, was shaped by a sequence of interconnected crises that unfolded gradually across the 14th and 15th centuries. These developments did not arrive all at once, nor did they affect every region in the same way. Instead, they emerged through overlapping processes that altered demographic patterns, economic relationships, political authority, and social expectations. Medieval society did not collapse during this time, but it was profoundly transformed by sustained pressure and repeated disruption. By the early 14th century, many regions of Europe had reached the limits of agricultural expansion. Population levels were high by medieval standards, and available land was already intensively cultivated. Marginal lands that had been brought into use during earlier centuries were less productive and more vulnerable to climatic variation. Small changes in weather patterns could now have significant consequences for food supply. A series of poor harvests early in the century exposed these vulnerabilities. Extended periods of cold and wet weather reduced crop yields. Grain shortages led to rising prices and widespread hunger. Malnutrition weakened populations, particularly among the rural poor, making them more susceptible to illness. These conditions did not affect all areas equally, but they marked the beginning of a more fragile demographic environment. Within this context of vulnerability, epidemic disease spread with unprecedented speed and scale. The most devastating outbreak occurred in the mid-14th century, when plague moved across Europe along trade and travel routes. Urban centers, with their dense populations and constant movement of people and goods, were particularly affected. Rural areas were not spared, as infection followed roads and river systems into the countryside. Mortality rates were extremely high by medieval standards. Entire households disappeared. Villages lost significant portions of their population. Urban neighborhoods were emptied. The scale of death disrupted normal patterns of life, work, and governance. Burial practices were strained, and traditional rituals could not always be maintained. The demographic impact of plague reshaped medieval society for generations. Population decline reduced pressure on land and resources, but it also created labor shortages. Fields went untilled. Workshops lacked skilled workers. Lords and landowners faced declining income as rents fell, and obligations could no longer be enforced as before. These changes altered the balance of power between landholders and laborers. Survivors found themselves in a stronger position to negotiate terms. Wages rose in many areas as employers competed for workers. Attempts by authorities to limit wages and restrict movement reflected efforts to preserve earlier social arrangements. But enforcement was uneven and often resisted. Social tension increased as expectations and realities diverged. Traditional hierarchies remained in place, but their foundations were weakened. In some regions, rural unrest emerged as peasants challenged obligations they viewed as outdated or unjust. These movements were shaped by local conditions and were often short-lived, but they reflected deeper structural change. Urban society was also transformed. Towns that had been growing steadily experienced sudden population loss. Some recovered quickly, while others declined permanently. Craft production was disrupted, but surviving artisans could command higher prices and greater independence. Merchant networks adjusted as demand patterns changed and labor became scarce. Political authority faced new challenges during this period. Rulers needed revenue to govern and defend their territories, but traditional sources of income were under strain. Taxation increased in many regions, often provoking resistance. Administrative systems expanded to manage these demands, contributing to the gradual growth of more complex state structures. Warfare compounded these pressures. Long-running conflicts between rival dynasties and territorial powers disrupted agriculture, trade, and settlement. Campaigns were often seasonal and localized, but their cumulative impact was significant. Armies moved through rural areas, consuming supplies and damaging infrastructure. Towns were besieged or fortified, altering urban life. Military organization evolved in response to these conditions. Rulers relied increasingly on paid soldiers rather than feudal levies. This shift required cash resources and administrative oversight. Standing forces were small by modern standards, but represented a change in how warfare was conducted and financed. The experience of prolonged conflict influenced political relationships. Nobles negotiated their obligations more carefully. Urban communities sought protections and privileges in exchange for financial support. Alliances shifted as circumstances changed, contributing to an atmosphere of uncertainty and adaptation. The Church also faced challenges during this period. Epidemic disease affected clergy as well as lay populations, reducing the number of trained religious leaders. Pastoral care was strained, and trust in institutions was tested. At the same time, religious life remained central to how people understood suffering and loss. Prayer, ritual, and charitable activity intensified in many communities. Intellectual and cultural responses to crisis varied. Some writers reflected on mortality, uncertainty, and the limits of human knowledge. Artistic expression adapted to new themes, emphasizing transience and moral reflection. These developments did not replace established traditions, but added new layers to medieval culture. Economic life continued despite disruption. Trade networks adjusted to changing conditions. Some regions benefited from reduced population pressure, allowing survivors access to more land and resources. Others struggled to recover from repeated shocks. Economic differentiation increased, with some communities adapting successfully and others declining. Urban governance evolved as towns managed population loss and economic change. Civic institutions took on greater responsibility for public order, health measures, and infrastructure. These efforts reflected a growing sense of collective responsibility, even as resources were limited. Legal systems adapted to new realities. Disputes over inheritance increased as mortality reshaped family structures. Courts addressed conflicts arising from labor mobility and contract renegotiation. Written records became more important in managing these complexities, contributing to the continued growth of administrative practice. Over time, demographic recovery began in some regions, though it was uneven and slow. Population levels remained below earlier peaks for generations. This prolonged adjustment allowed new social and economic patterns to stabilize. Labor relations changed permanently in many areas. Landholding arrangements became more flexible. By the 15th century, medieval society had been reshaped by a century of crisis and adaptation. Institutions had not collapsed, but they had been tested and transformed. Political authority became more administrative. Economic life became more differentiated. Social relationships adjusted to new balances of power. The late Middle Ages were therefore not simply a period of decline, but one of transition. Crisis exposed vulnerabilities within medieval structures, while also creating opportunities for change. The world that emerged retained many medieval characteristics, but it operated under different assumptions and constraints. As these transformations continued, they prepared the ground for further developments. The next phase of European history would build upon the adaptations forged during this time, moving gradually away from medieval patterns toward new forms of organization and thought. The transition from the medieval world toward what is later described as early modern Europe unfolded slowly and unevenly over the course of the 15th century and into the early 16th. It did not represent a clean break with the past, nor was it experienced as a single moment of change by those living through it. Instead, this transition consisted of many overlapping adjustments in political authority, economic organization, social relationships, and cultural practice. Medieval structures continued to function, but they did so under new pressures and with gradually shifting expectations. Political authority during this period showed increasing tendencies toward consolidation, though older forms of rule remained influential. Kingship in many regions became more stable and more institutionalized. Rulers relied less exclusively on personal bonds of loyalty and more on administrative mechanisms that could operate across wider territories. Written records, taxation systems, and permanent councils expanded in scope and regularity. These developments built directly on medieval practices rather than replacing them. Royal courts became more fixed in location and procedure. Where medieval kings had often ruled by moving continuously through their territories, later rulers increasingly governed from established capitals. These courts served as centers of administration, diplomacy, and legal authority. Officials trained in law and record-keeping played a growing role in governance. Their expertise reflected the long medieval tradition of clerical literacy, now applied more systematically to secular administration. Noble power adapted rather than disappeared. Aristocratic families continued to control land and exercise local authority, but their relationship with rulers became more formalized. Service obligations were increasingly defined in legal and financial terms. Military service, once based largely on feudal arrangements, was supplemented or replaced by monetary payments and contractual agreements. This shift allowed rulers greater flexibility in organizing defense and warfare. Warfare itself changed gradually. Medieval patterns of seasonal campaigning and localized conflict persisted, but larger and more coordinated military efforts became more common. Rulers required greater financial resources to support these activities, reinforcing the importance of taxation and credit. This development strengthened administrative institutions and deepened the connection between governance and economic management. Urban centers played an increasingly significant role in this evolving political landscape. Towns and cities were already well established by the late medieval period, but their influence expanded further during this transitional phase. Urban elites participated in governance through councils, advisory bodies, and representative assemblies. In some regions, towns provided crucial financial support to rulers in exchange for privileges and political recognition. Economic life continued to diversify. Agriculture remained the foundation of society, but the patterns of production and exchange grew more complex. Market activity intensified as rural producers engaged more regularly with urban centers. Specialization increased, with certain regions focusing on particular crops, textiles, or manufactured goods. These patterns reflected long-term medieval developments now operating on a broader scale. Trade networks extended further and became more resilient. Overland and maritime routes connected distant regions with greater frequency. Merchants developed more sophisticated practices to manage risk, credit, and partnership. These practices evolved from medieval commercial traditions and were supported by improved record-keeping and communication. Economic life remained vulnerable to disruption, but its overall reach expanded. Money played an increasingly central role in daily transactions. While barter and payment in kind continued in many contexts, coinage and credit instruments were used more widely. Rents, wages, and taxes were often paid in money rather than produce. This monetization altered social relationships, making obligations more flexible but also more impersonal. Social structures adjusted in response to these economic and political changes. The rigid hierarchies often associated with medieval society remained influential, but mobility increased in certain contexts. Urban life offered opportunities for advancement through trade, craft, and administration. Education, while still limited, became more relevant beyond strictly clerical settings. Family structures and inheritance practices adapted to new conditions. Noble families sought to preserve estates through legal mechanisms and strategic marriages. Urban families invested in education and commercial networks. Peasant households continued to rely on customary arrangements. But these too evolved as landholding patterns changed. Cultural life during this transition reflected both continuity and adaptation. Religious practice remained central to daily life, shaping moral expectations and communal rhythms. At the same time, forms of expression diversified. Art, literature, and architecture drew on medieval traditions while exploring new themes and techniques. These changes emerged gradually, often within established religious and social frameworks. Learning and scholarship continued to expand. Institutions of education that had developed during the medieval period persisted and adapted. The study of law, theology, and philosophy remained important, but interest in history, language, and practical knowledge grew. Scholars built on medieval methods of analysis while exploring a wider range of sources. The use of written language increased across many areas of life. Administrative documents, legal contracts, and commercial records became more common. This expansion of documentation reflected practical needs rather than abstract ideals. Literacy remained limited, but its social importance grew steadily. Religious institutions experienced both continuity and strain. The church remained a powerful presence, owning land, shaping education, and guiding moral life. However, tensions within ecclesiastical structures became more visible. Administrative complexity increased, and relationships between local clergy and central authority were sometimes strained. These developments reflected the scale and longevity of medieval religious organization rather than a sudden decline. Political boundaries during this period became more clearly defined. Territories associated with long-standing medieval entities, such as the Holy Roman Empire, continued to exist, but their internal organization evolved. Authority was negotiated among rulers, nobles, cities, and institutions, producing layered systems of governance. The idea of the state, while not fully formed in a modern sense, began to take clearer shape. Governance was increasingly associated with territory, population, and law, rather than solely with personal rule. This development was cumulative, rooted in medieval administrative practice and refined through experience. Despite these changes, daily life for most people retained familiar patterns. Agricultural work followed seasonal rhythms. Religious observance structured time and community life. Local customs continued to regulate behavior and resolve disputes. Change was often experienced as gradual adjustment rather than disruption. By the end of the 15th century, Europe stood within a landscape shaped by centuries of medieval development and decades of adaptation. The institutions, relationships, and practices that defined medieval society had not disappeared. Instead, they were being reoriented to meet new circumstances. This process of transition was incomplete and uneven, setting the stage for further transformation. The continuation of this transition did not accelerate suddenly, nor did it resolve into a clear new order within a short span of time. Instead, the later phase of this long movement, extending through the late 15th and early 16th centuries, was characterized by the settling and gradual reorientation of medieval structures. The social, political, and cultural frameworks inherited from the Middle Ages remained deeply embedded in European life. What changed was the way these frameworks were used, understood, and connected to one another. Political authority continued its slow shift toward greater permanence and administrative depth. Rulers increasingly governed through institutions that outlasted individual reigns. Councils, courts, and financial offices became regular features of governance rather than temporary solutions. These bodies relied on written procedure, precedent, and trained officials. Such developments were not revolutionary. They reflected the cumulative outcome of medieval experimentation with law, record-keeping, and delegated authority. The relationship between ruler and subject also evolved gradually. Medieval ideas of personal loyalty and obligation remained influential, but they were increasingly supplemented by impersonal forms of rule. Taxes were assessed according to more regular principles. Laws were proclaimed as applicable to wider populations. Justice was presented as an expression of territorial authority rather than personal judgment alone. These changes unfolded unevenly, often meeting resistance or requiring negotiation. Noble society adapted to this environment by redefining its role. Land ownership remained central to aristocratic identity, but military service was no longer the sole or even primary expression of status in many regions. Nobles participated in administration, diplomacy, and court culture. Titles and honors continued to matter, but they were increasingly tied to service within structured institutions. This adaptation allowed noble families to retain influence while accommodating changing political realities. Military organization reflected similar patterns of continuity and adjustment. Feudal levies and traditional obligations persisted, especially in local contexts. Alongside them, rulers relied more consistently on paid forces, contracts, and centralized supply. These arrangements required planning, accounting, and coordination. They did not eliminate medieval warfare, but they altered its scale, duration, and management. Economic life continued to expand in complexity. The integration of regional economies deepened as production, trade, and finance became more interconnected. Urban centers played a central role in this process. Towns were no longer simply marketplaces or craft centers. They became hubs of administration, finance, and cultural exchange. Urban institutions developed their own traditions of governance, often balancing autonomy with cooperation with territorial rulers. Rural society also experienced gradual change. Agricultural practices continued to evolve, responding to market demand and demographic conditions. Landholding arrangements became more flexible in some areas, allowing leasing and wage labor to supplement traditional obligations. These adjustments were practical responses rather than ideological shifts. They reflected the need to manage land and labor efficiently under changing conditions. Social hierarchy remained a defining feature of European society, but its boundaries became more permeable in certain contexts. Wealth acquired through trade, administration, or professional service could translate into status over time. Education gained importance as a means of advancement, particularly within administrative and legal careers. These opportunities were limited, but they marked a departure from earlier patterns in which land and birth were nearly exclusive determinants of position. Cultural life during this period retained strong medieval characteristics, while incorporating new emphases. Religious practice continued to structure daily rhythms, moral expectations, and community identity. Churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions remained central. At the same time, religious expression became more varied, reflecting regional traditions and local priorities. This diversity was managed within existing institutional frameworks, rather than breaking away from them. Learning and scholarship remained rooted in medieval educational traditions. Methods of study, reliance on authoritative texts, and use of Latin continued. However, the range of subjects broadened, and interest in practical knowledge increased. History, geography, and administrative skills gained attention alongside theology and law. These developments were incremental and often driven by the needs of governance and commerce. The expansion of written culture continued to reshape social interaction. Contracts, correspondence, and records became more common. This did not mean that society became fully literate, but it did mean that written documentation increasingly underpinned authority and obligation. Trust was reinforced through documentation, and memory was preserved through archives rather than solely through oral tradition. Family life and social relationships adapted quietly to these conditions. Marriage continued to serve as a means of alliance and economic stability. Inheritance practices reflected a balance between tradition and adaptation, preserving family continuity while responding to legal and economic pressures. Household organization remained central to production and social identity. The experience of time itself was shaped by continuity. Seasonal rhythms, religious calendars, and customary practices persisted. Change was rarely perceived as a sharp break. Instead, it was experienced as gradual adjustment within familiar structures. Medieval habits of thought, belief, and organization remained influential, even as their context shifted. By the early 16th century, European society had moved some distance from the conditions of the early Middle Ages, yet it had not left them behind entirely. The institutions, relationships, and cultural forms that had developed over centuries continued to provide stability and meaning. What distinguished this period was not the abandonment of the medieval world, but its reconfiguration. The medieval past remained present in law, religion, social hierarchy, and cultural memory. At the same time, new patterns of administration, economy, and communication were becoming established. These patterns did not announce themselves dramatically. They settled into place through use, habit, and necessity. This long transition did not conclude with a clear ending. Instead, medieval society gradually eased into new forms. While retaining much of its inherited structure, the pace of daily life remained steady. Fields were worked, markets opened, courts convened, and rituals were observed. The world continued, shaped by both memory and adaptation, moving forward without abrupt resolution and settling quietly into the rhythms of another age.